Imagine standing on a misty morning in ancient China, when the land was torn by war and uncertainty. There, in the shadows of history, rose a king unlike any before him. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. Some say he was obsessed, maybe even haunted, by a single impossible dream: to live forever, to conquer not just his enemies, but even death itself. Picture the world he inherited. China was not one peaceful country, but a patchwork of kingdoms, each one plotting its own destiny. For centuries, these kingdoms fought endlessly, each convinced it was destined to rule. Into this chaos stepped Qin Shi Huang, a young ruler with extraordinary ambition. Instead of making peace, he set out to do what no one else dared. He wanted to fuse all these lands together, forging a single unbreakable empire from the ashes of war. But dreams like his always come with a question: at what cost? This is the beginning of the Qin Dynasty, the first imperial dynasty in Chinese history. It was a time of fire and blood, filled with breathtaking achievements and deep shadows. The emperor's quest for immortality still echoes today, not just because of what he built, but because of what he lost. Have you ever wondered how one person can change the course of history, or why some empires vanish almost as quickly as they appear? Qin Shi Huang's story is a journey into those very questions. His reign lasted only 15 years, but those years would shape China for centuries to come. And here's a curiosity you might not know. While most rulers built palaces for the living, Qin Shi Huang built one for himself in the afterlife. He ordered the creation of the famous Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized soldiers, each one unique, buried to protect him on his journey beyond death. Even now, his true tomb remains sealed, surrounded by legends of rivers of mercury and mysterious traps. So, as we travel through the story of the Qin Dynasty together, think about this. Was the first emperor a visionary or just another ruler blinded by his own ambition? How did he manage to unite a land so divided, and why did his empire disappear in just 15 years? If you love uncovering the unexpected twists of history as much as we do, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. Let's dive into the story of a king who tried to outlast time itself and discover what he left behind. Picture this. It's the 3rd century before Christ, and China isn't the unified empire we know today. Instead, imagine a land fractured into 7 powerful kingdoms, each one hungry for dominance, each one convinced they're destined to rule all others. For over 2 centuries, these states had been locked in an endless cycle of warfare, alliances, and betrayals. Soldiers marched across bloodied fields, diplomats whispered in shadowy courts, and ordinary people wondered if peace would ever come to their war-torn world. Into this chaos was born a boy named Ying Zheng in 259 before Christ. But this wasn't just any ordinary prince. From his earliest days, young Zheng breathed the air of ambition and conquest. His kingdom, Qin, sat in the western reaches of this fractured land, and while other rulers played political games, Zheng dreamed of something far grander. He envisioned a single China, united under one banner, one law, one emperor. What made Zheng different wasn't just his ambition, though. It was his willingness to embrace ideas that other rulers found too radical, too dangerous. While most kingdoms still clung to old feudal traditions, Zheng surrounded himself with advisors who believed in something called legalism. This wasn't the gentle philosophy of Confucius that spoke of virtue and harmony. No, legalism was cold, calculating, and brutally effective. It said that people were naturally selfish and needed strict laws and harsh punishments to create order. Enter Li Si, perhaps one of history's most brilliant and ruthless political minds. This man became Zheng's chancellor and closest advisor, and together they crafted a strategy that would change the world forever. Li Si understood something that other kingdoms missed. War wasn't just about having brave soldiers or clever generals. It was about organization, efficiency, and the ability to mobilize every resource toward a single goal. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. While other armies were still using weapons crafted by individual blacksmiths, each one slightly different from the next, the Qin military revolutionized warfare in a way that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Age. They created the world's first mass-produced weapons with interchangeable parts. Imagine thousands of crossbow triggers, each one identical to the next, manufactured in workshops across the kingdom. If a soldier's weapon broke in battle, any trigger from any other crossbow would fit perfectly. This might seem like a small detail, but think about what it meant. Qin armies could march farther, fight longer, and maintain their equipment with an efficiency that left their enemies baffled. While rival kingdoms struggled with supply lines and broken weapons, Qin soldiers fought with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But the real genius lay in how Zheng and Li Si approached conquest itself. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies, they wanted to absorb them completely. When Qin armies conquered a territory, they didn't simply install a new ruler and demand tribute. Instead, they systematically dismantled the old feudal structures, relocated populations to prevent rebellions, and rebuilt society according to Qin principles. One by one, the great kingdoms fell. Han collapsed first, then Zhao, then Wei. Each victory made the next conquest easier, as Qin's reputation for ruthless efficiency spread terror across the land. Enemy soldiers began surrendering before battles even started. Nobles fled their palaces rather than face the inevitable Qin war machine. The most remarkable part of this conquest wasn't the military brilliance, though that was certainly impressive. It was the methodical way Zheng transformed warfare into something almost scientific. His armies moved with mathematical precision, his supply lines operated like clockwork, and his intelligence networks gathered information with the efficiency of a modern corporation. By 221 before Christ, the impossible had happened. The last independent kingdom surrendered to Qin forces, and for the first time in centuries, all of China bowed to a single ruler. Yingzheng had achieved what countless kings before him had only dreamed of. But rather than simply calling himself king of a conquered land, he chose a title that had never existed before: Shi Huang, the first emperor. The boy who had grown up in a world of endless war had not only ended that war, but had fundamentally changed what it meant to rule in China. He had taken 7 separate civilizations and forged them into something entirely new. The age of the warring states was over, and the age of imperial China had begun. Now imagine standing in the imperial palace in 221 before Christ, watching history unfold before your eyes. The man who had once been simply Yingzheng now bore a title that had never existed before: Shi Huang, which means first emperor. But this wasn't just a name change. It was a declaration that everything about how China worked was about to transform completely. The newly crowned emperor faced a challenge that no ruler in history had ever confronted. How do you govern 7 distinct kingdoms, each with their own customs, laws, currencies, and even writing systems? How do you prevent them from simply breaking apart the moment your armies march away? Other conquerors throughout history had simply demanded tribute and left local rulers in place. But the first emperor had a far more ambitious vision. He decided to erase the old world entirely and build something completely new in its place. The first target was the feudal system that had defined Chinese society for centuries. Under feudalism, powerful nobles owned vast estates and commanded the loyalty of thousands of peasants and warriors. These lords had ruled like kings within their own territories, collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and passing their power down through their families. The first emperor saw this system as the root of China's endless wars and decided it had to disappear. In a series of sweeping decrees that must have sent shockwaves across the empire, he stripped these ancient noble families of their lands and power. Imagine being a duke whose family had ruled the same territory for 10 generations, only to wake up one morning and discover that you were now just another citizen under direct imperial rule. The emperor relocated many of these former nobles to the capital city, where he could keep a close eye on them and prevent any thoughts of rebellion. But dismantling feudalism was just the beginning. The first emperor understood something profound about human nature and political power. If you want to truly unite people, you have to give them common experiences, common references, and common ways of understanding the world. This brings us to one of the most controversial decisions in Chinese history. Across the former kingdoms, scholars and teachers had preserved thousands of ancient texts representing different philosophical traditions, historical accounts, and ways of thinking. The emperor saw these diverse intellectual traditions not as treasures to be preserved, but as seeds of division that could tear his new empire apart. The burning of the books began systematically across the empire. Confucian texts, which emphasized virtue, tradition, and the importance of learned scholars in government, were particularly targeted. From the emperor's perspective, these ideas represented everything wrong with the old system. Confucians believed that good rulers should listen to wise advisors and follow ancient customs. The first emperor believed that good subjects should simply obey their emperor without question. When scholars protested these book burnings, the emperor's response was swift and unforgiving. Those who continued to criticize his policies or cling to the old ways found themselves facing the ultimate punishment. According to historical accounts, hundreds of scholars were executed for their resistance to the new order. Now you might wonder how the emperor planned to replace all this destroyed knowledge and tradition. The answer lay in his commitment to legalism, the political philosophy that had helped him conquer China in the first place. Legalism taught that human beings were naturally selfish and untrustworthy, and that only strict laws with harsh punishments could create a peaceful society. Under this system, citizens didn't need to think about philosophy or ethics. They simply needed to know what the law required and follow it exactly. But here's where the first emperor's genius truly shines through. And it's in the details that most people never hear about. While he was destroying the old intellectual and political structures, he was simultaneously creating something unprecedented in human civilization, complete standardization across an enormous territory. Consider what China looked like before unification. In the former kingdom of Chu, people used one type of coin, wrote certain characters in a particular way, and built their cartwheels to a specific width. Travel a few hundred miles to the former kingdom of Shi, and you'd find completely different coins, different writing styles, and carts built to different specifications. A merchant trying to trade across these regions would need to exchange money multiple times, learn several writing systems, and might even find that his cart couldn't travel on certain roads because the wheel ruts were the wrong size. The first emperor decided to fix all of this through what might be history's most comprehensive standardization program. He declared that throughout the entire empire, there would be one writing system, one currency, one system of weights and measures, and yes, even one standard width for cart axles. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. A farmer could now travel from the far western reaches of the empire to the eastern coast and use the same coins everywhere. A scholar could write a letter in the capital and know that someone hundreds of miles away could read it exactly as intended. A merchant could load goods onto a cart and travel any road in the empire without worrying about whether his wheels would fit the ruts. This standardization extended to details that seem almost comically specific, but were actually brilliant strokes of administrative genius. The emperor standardized the distance between furrows in plowed fields, ensuring that farming tools would work everywhere. He standardized the length of sleeves on official garments, so that government workers across the empire would look identical. He even standardized the width of horse harnesses, making it easier for the imperial postal system to function efficiently. The psychological impact of all this standardization was enormous. For the first time in centuries, people living in distant parts of China began to feel like they belonged to the same civilization. When you used the same money, wrote with the same characters, and saw the same imperial symbols everywhere you traveled, you started to think of yourself not as a citizen of your local region, but as a subject of the emperor. Yet beneath this impressive administrative achievement lay a darker reality. The first emperor's vision of unity came at the cost of diversity, creativity, and intellectual freedom. The same efficiency that made trade and communication easier also made it easier for the imperial government to monitor and control every aspect of people's lives. The empire he created was like a perfectly organized machine, but it was a machine where every human being was expected to function as an identical, replaceable part. And as we'll see in the next part of our story, this iron-fisted approach to unity would create both magnificent achievements and terrible human costs that would echo through Chinese history for centuries to come. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. Picture yourself standing on the northern frontier of China in the early days of the first emperor's reign. The landscape stretches endlessly before you, vast grasslands rolling toward distant mountains under an enormous sky. It's beautiful, but it's also terrifying, because somewhere out there in that seemingly empty wilderness lives a people who have become the empire's greatest nightmare, the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu weren't like any enemy the Chinese had faced during the Warring States period. Those earlier conflicts had been between settled kingdoms with cities, farms, and predictable armies. But the Xiongnu were nomads, masters of the horse and bow, who could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike with devastating speed, and vanish back into the steppes before any conventional army could respond. Imagine being a Chinese farmer working your fields near the northern border. One moment you're peacefully tending your crops, and the next moment you hear the thunder of hoofbeats. Before you can even react, mounted warriors sweep through your village like a sudden storm. They take whatever they want, capture whoever seems useful, and disappear as quickly as they came, leaving behind only dust and devastation. This had been happening for generations, but now it posed a unique problem for the first emperor. He had spent years conquering and unifying China, creating this perfectly organized empire with its standardized everything. But what good was all that organization if nomadic raiders could simply ignore his borders and strike wherever they pleased? The emperor's advisors debated various solutions. Some suggested diplomatic approaches, perhaps offering tribute or arranged marriages to keep the peace. Others recommended massive military campaigns to hunt down the nomadic tribes. But the first emperor had a different vision, one that was characteristically ambitious and bold. He would build a wall so massive, so impregnable, that it would seal off the northern frontier entirely. Now, walls weren't a new idea in Chinese warfare. During the Warring States period, several kingdoms had built defensive barriers along their borders, but these were relatively modest affairs, earthen ramparts or wooden palisades designed to slow down invading armies. What the first emperor envisioned was something entirely different, a continuous barrier stretching across hundreds of miles of the most challenging terrain imaginable. The project began around 220 before Christ, and from the very beginning it was clear that this would be unlike any construction project in human history. The emperor ordered that existing wall segments from the former warring states be connected and extended, but most of the wall would need to be built from scratch across mountains, deserts, and river valleys. Here's something most people don't realize about the Great Wall. It wasn't just a single barrier. It was actually an entire defensive system, complete with watchtowers, garrison forts, supply depots, and beacon stations for sending smoke signals. The wall itself was just one part of a sophisticated military infrastructure designed to detect, delay, and repel invasions. The engineering challenges were absolutely staggering. Imagine trying to build a massive stone and earth barrier across terrain where pack animals could barely travel, where winters brought killing cold and summers brought scorching heat. The workers had to quarry stone from mountainsides, transport it to construction sites using nothing but human labor and simple tools, then fit the blocks together with mathematical precision. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the wall's construction was how the emperor solved the labor problem. This was the ancient world, remember, with no machinery, no modern transportation, and no industrial infrastructure. Building something of this scale required an enormous workforce, and the emperor found that workforce by essentially drafting his entire empire. Soldiers formed the backbone of the construction crews, but they were joined by peasants fulfilling their labor obligations to the state, prisoners working off their sentences, and scholars who had been sentenced to hard labor for opposing imperial policies. According to historical records, over 300,000 people worked on the wall at any given time, with the total number of workers over the years reaching into the millions. The human cost of this project was staggering in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend today. Workers labored in conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. They worked through blazing summers and bitter winters, often with inadequate food and shelter. Many died from exhaustion, disease, exposure, or accidents during construction. There's an ancient Chinese saying that every stone in the Great Wall cost a human life, and while this might be poetic exaggeration, it captures something true about the enormous sacrifice involved. Families across the empire watched as their sons, fathers, and brothers marched north to work on the wall, knowing that many would never return home. Yet despite the tremendous human cost, the wall did achieve some of its intended purposes. The Xiongnu found it much more difficult to conduct their lightning raids into Chinese territory. The barrier forced them to concentrate their attacks at specific points, where Chinese forces could be waiting in strength. The watchtower system allowed defenders to spot approaching raiders from miles away and send warning signals across vast distances in a matter of hours. But here's the fascinating paradox of the Great Wall. While it may have solved the immediate military problem, it created a much deeper political one. The massive scale of the project, combined with its enormous human cost, generated resentment that spread throughout the empire like a slow-burning fire. Think about it from the perspective of an ordinary Chinese family. The emperor had already turned their world upside down by destroying the feudal system, burning ancient books, and imposing new laws. Now he was demanding that they send their loved ones to work on this massive construction project in distant, dangerous borderlands. Many of these workers never returned, and those who did often came back broken in body and spirit. The wall also represented something troubling about the nature of the emperor's rule. Here was a leader who could mobilize the resources of an entire civilization to build something unprecedented in human history, but he was doing it through compulsion rather than inspiration. People worked on the wall not because they believed in the project, but because they had no choice. Moreover, the defensive mentality represented by the wall seemed to contradict the dynamic, expansionist energy that had made the Qin conquest possible in the first place. The same empire that had dreamed of unifying all under heaven was now building barriers to keep the outside world at bay. The Xiongnu, for their part, adapted to the new reality with characteristic nomadic flexibility. Unable to conduct easy raids into Chinese territory, they began organizing into larger, more sophisticated confederations. In some ways, the wall helped create the very threat it was designed to prevent by forcing the nomadic tribes to unite and develop more advanced military tactics. As the years passed, the Great Wall became a symbol of both imperial power and imperial burden. It demonstrated that the first emperor could accomplish seemingly impossible feats through sheer force of will and organization. But it also showed that even the most powerful ruler in the world couldn't solve every problem through construction projects and mass mobilization. The wall stood as a monument to human achievement and human suffering, a reminder that great accomplishments often come at great costs. And in the villages and towns across the empire, families mourning their lost loved ones began to whisper questions that would grow louder with each passing year. Was this really the kind of unity they had wanted? Was this really the price of peace? These whispers of discontent, born from the suffering required to build the Great Wall, would eventually grow into something much more dangerous for the emperor and his dynasty. But that's a story for another part of our journey through this remarkable period in human history. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, ruler of an empire larger than anything in human history, capable of moving mountains and redirecting rivers with a single command. You've conquered every enemy, unified every kingdom, and reshaped civilization itself according to your vision. But there's one opponent you cannot defeat. One enemy that grows stronger with each passing day: time itself. This was the paradox that consumed the first emperor's mind as he entered the later years of his reign. The man who had solved every other impossible problem now faced the one challenge that had defeated every human being who had ever lived: mortality. And rather than accepting this universal human condition with grace or wisdom, the emperor became obsessed with conquering death just as thoroughly as he had conquered China. The obsession began subtly, as these things often do. Court physicians and advisors began mentioning ancient legends about immortal sages who had discovered the secrets of eternal life. They spoke of mysterious islands far across the eastern seas, where magical herbs grew that could grant immortality to those pure enough to find them. They whispered about alchemical formulas that could transform base metals into gold and ordinary men into gods. For most rulers, these would have remained nothing more than entertaining stories. But the first emperor was not most rulers. He was a man who had turned the impossible into reality so many times that he genuinely believed no goal was beyond his reach. If unity could be achieved through force and organization, why couldn't immortality be achieved through the same methods? The emperor's first approach was characteristically systematic. He dispatched expeditions across the known world, searching for these mythical lands and magical substances. One of the most famous of these expeditions was led by a man named Xu Fu, who convinced the emperor that he could find the islands of the immortals somewhere in the eastern seas. Picture the scale of this undertaking. Hundreds of ships loaded with thousands of young men and women, along with craftsmen, scholars, and supplies for what might be a journey of years. The emperor spared no expense, providing Xu Fu with everything he might possibly need to succeed in this impossible quest. The expedition sailed east into the vast Pacific, and here's the fascinating part: they were never seen again. Some historians believe they may have reached Japan and settled there, becoming ancestors of the Japanese people. Others think they simply vanished into the ocean's depths. But the emperor's search for immortality wasn't limited to these grand expeditions. He also turned to the ancient Chinese practice of alchemy, surrounding himself with mysterious figures who claimed to understand the secrets of eternal life. These alchemists promised him that the right combination of minerals and herbs, properly prepared and consumed, could transform his mortal body into something divine. This is where the story takes a tragically ironic turn. The alchemists convinced the emperor that mercury, that strange liquid metal that flows like water but shines like silver, was a key ingredient in the elixir of immortality. They prepared pills containing mercury and other toxic substances, telling him that regular consumption would gradually purify his body and grant him eternal life. The emperor faithfully took these mercury pills for years, believing he was gradually becoming immortal. In reality, he was slowly poisoning himself with one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. The mercury accumulating in his system would have caused tremors, memory loss, irritability, and eventual organ failure. The very substance he believed would grant him eternal life was actually shortening the life he had. But perhaps the most extraordinary expression of the emperor's obsession with immortality was his tomb complex, a project that dwarfed even the Great Wall in its ambition and extravagance. If he couldn't achieve immortality in life, he would create an afterlife so magnificent and well-protected that he could continue ruling from beyond the grave. The tomb complex began construction early in his reign and continued for decades, employing over 700,000 workers at its peak. But this wasn't just a burial site. It was an entire underground empire, complete with palaces, gardens, rivers, and an army. The emperor commissioned craftsmen to create what we now know as the Terracotta Army. Over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers, each one individually crafted with unique facial features, clothing, and equipment. Think about the incredible attention to detail involved in this project. Each terracotta warrior was not just a generic statue, but a portrait of an actual person. The craftsmen studied real soldiers, capturing their expressions, their stances, even the way their armor fit their bodies. Generals stood tall and confident, while foot soldiers maintained alert, ready postures. Archers held their bows with practiced ease, and cavalry officers seemed to pat their clay horses with familiar affection. But the soldiers were just the beginning. The tomb complex included terracotta officials to run the emperor's afterlife bureaucracy, acrobats to entertain him, and even clay musicians to provide eternal concerts. There were bronze chariots with intricate decorations, weapons forged with the same precision as those used by living armies, and countless treasures meant to ensure the emperor's comfort in the next world. The main burial chamber itself was designed as a replica of the emperor's earthly empire. According to ancient accounts, rivers of mercury flowed through the tomb, representing the great rivers of China. The ceiling was decorated with pearls and precious stones arranged to mirror the night sky, complete with constellations that would wheel overhead for eternity. Lamps burning whale oil provided light meant to last forever. Here's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. The emperor's tomb remains sealed to this day, over 2,000 years after his death. Modern archaeologists have located the burial chamber using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced techniques, and they've confirmed some of the ancient accounts. Soil samples around the tomb show extremely high levels of mercury, suggesting that those legendary mercury rivers might actually exist. But opening the tomb remains incredibly challenging, not just because of potential mercury contamination, but because ancient Chinese engineering was far more sophisticated than most people realize. The tomb was designed with elaborate security systems, including crossbow traps that would fire automatically if triggered, and other defensive mechanisms meant to protect the emperor's rest for all eternity. There's something deeply moving about imagining this underground world, this vast city of the dead created by a man who couldn't accept that his story would ever end. In his desperation to cheat death, the first emperor created what might be the most elaborate funeral monument in human history. Yet for all its grandeur, the tomb also represents the ultimate futility of trying to control the uncontrollable. The emperor's obsession with immortality reveals something profoundly human about even the most powerful rulers. Despite all his achievements, despite reshaping the world according to his will, he remained as vulnerable to fear and hope as any ordinary person. His mercury pills and magical expeditions were really no different from the desperate measures people have always taken when facing mortality. In the end, the emperor's quest for immortality achieved a kind of success he never intended. While his body died in 210 before Christ, likely poisoned by the very substances he believed would save him, his story has indeed lived forever. His tomb, his terracotta army, and his impossible dreams have captured human imagination for over 2 millennia. But as we'll see in the final part of our story, the emperor's death would expose the fundamental weakness in his perfectly organized empire. It had been built around one man's will, and when that man was gone, everything he had created would begin to crumble with shocking speed. Picture the scene. It's the summer of 210 before Christ, and the first emperor is traveling through his vast domain on what would become his final journey. He's inspecting the eastern provinces, perhaps still hoping to hear news from one of his immortality expeditions, when the mercury poisoning that has been slowly destroying his body finally claims him. The man who conquered death's greatest enemy, time itself, dies far from his capital, his dreams of immortality crumbling with his mortal flesh. But here's where the story becomes even more dramatic than fiction could ever be. The emperor's death created an immediate crisis that his perfectly organized empire was completely unprepared to handle. You see, for all his systematic planning, the first emperor had made one fatal oversight. He had built an entire civilization around his personal authority, but he had never adequately prepared for succession. The emperor's closest advisor, the brilliant Li Si, who had helped architect the conquest of China, now found himself in an impossible position. The imperial party was still hundreds of miles from the capital, traveling through territories where news of the emperor's death could spark immediate rebellions. Li Si made a decision that would haunt Chinese history. He decided to hide the emperor's death until they could return to the capital and manage the succession carefully. Imagine the surreal nature of this deception. The emperor's body was placed in a sealed carriage, and the imperial procession continued its journey as if nothing had happened. Meals were still delivered to the emperor's carriage each day. Courtiers still approached to receive his supposed commands, which Li Si would relay after pretending to consult with the hidden corpse. To mask the smell of decomposition in the summer heat, the conspirators loaded the baggage train with rotting fish, claiming it was a delicacy the emperor had suddenly developed a taste for. This macabre charade continued for weeks. But when the imperial party finally reached the capital, the succession crisis exploded into the open. The emperor had intended for his eldest son, Fusu, to inherit the throne. Fusu was known to be more moderate than his father, possibly even sympathetic to Confucian ideals that the emperor had tried to destroy. But Li Si and the powerful court eunuch Zhao Gao saw an opportunity to maintain their own influence by placing a more pliable ruler on the throne. They forged the emperor's final edict, naming his younger son Hu Hai as heir and ordering Fusu to take his own life for supposed crimes against the state. The deception worked, but it placed a weak and inexperienced young man on the throne of the world's most complex empire at the moment when strong leadership was most desperately needed. Emperor Hu Hai, who took the name Qin Shi Huang, meaning second emperor, was everything his father had not been. Where the first emperor had been decisive, the second emperor was indecisive. Where the first emperor had been ruthlessly focused, the second emperor was easily manipulated by court officials pursuing their own agendas. Most crucially, where the first emperor had commanded genuine respect through fear and awe, the second emperor inspired neither. The empire's problems began almost immediately. The massive construction projects that had employed millions of people were suddenly halted or scaled back, throwing vast numbers of workers into unemployment and poverty. The harsh legalist laws remained in place, but without the first emperor's iron will to enforce them consistently, they began to seem arbitrary and unfair rather than simply inevitable. The breaking point came when a group of peasants conscripted for military service realized they were going to be late reporting to their assigned posts. Under Qin law, the penalty for arriving late was the same as the penalty for desertion: death. Faced with execution either way, these ordinary farmers made a fateful decision. If they were going to die anyway, they might as well die fighting the system that had condemned them. This small act of desperate rebellion sparked something extraordinary. Across the empire, people who had endured years of harsh rule while the first emperor lived began to rise up once his controlling presence was gone. Peasants who had lost family members building the Great Wall joined the revolt. Former nobles whose families had been stripped of power saw an opportunity for revenge. Even some Qin officials began switching sides as they realized the dynasty was crumbling. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the empire, led by men like Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, simple peasants who became the faces of popular uprising, and Xiang Yu, an aristocrat from the former kingdom of Chu, who commanded brilliant military campaigns against Qin forces. But perhaps the most significant rebel was Liu Bang, a minor official who would eventually emerge from the chaos to found a new dynasty. The second emperor and his advisors proved completely incapable of handling this crisis. They turned on each other instead of facing the external threat, with Li Si eventually being executed by his former ally Zhao Gao in a palace coup that further weakened the government. By 206 before Christ, just 4 years after the first emperor's death, rebel armies were marching on the capital itself. The end came swiftly. The second emperor was killed, the capital fell, and the Qin Dynasty that had seemed destined to rule forever simply ceased to exist. In the space of less than 5 years, the most powerful empire in the world had completely collapsed, torn apart by the very forces its founder had tried so hard to control. But here's the fascinating paradox that makes this story so much more than just another tale of rise and fall. Even as the Qin dynasty died, its most important innovations lived on. The rebel leader Liu Bang, who emerged victorious from the chaos and founded the Han Dynasty, kept almost all of the first emperor's administrative systems. The standardized currency, the unified writing system, the centralized government structure, even many of the harsh laws were retained because they worked. The Han Dynasty, which would rule China for over 400 years, was essentially the Qin system with a human face. They kept the emperor's practical innovations while abandoning his most brutal excesses. They maintained centralized control while allowing more intellectual freedom. They preserved unity while permitting more regional variation. This tells us something profound about the first emperor's legacy. His dynasty failed not because his ideas were wrong, but because he pushed them to inhuman extremes. The basic vision of a unified, centrally administered China was so powerful that it survived the collapse of the regime that created it and became the template for Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Every major Chinese dynasty that followed, from the Han to the Tang to the Ming to the Qing, used governmental structures that the first emperor had invented. The idea of China as a single unified empire, rather than a collection of separate kingdoms, became so fundamental that it survived wars, invasions, and countless political upheavals. Even today, the People's Republic of China governs a territory that closely matches what the first emperor unified over 2 millennia ago. So what are we to make of this extraordinary figure? Was the first emperor a visionary who created the foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations? Or was he a tyrant whose cruelty nearly destroyed what he was trying to build? The answer, I think, is that he was both, and that's what makes his story so compelling and so troubling. He was a leader who understood that great achievements sometimes require great sacrifices, but he may have lost sight of the difference between necessary sacrifice and unnecessary suffering. He created systems that brought prosperity and stability to millions of people, but he did so through methods that caused immense pain to millions of others. He unified a civilization and gave it tools that would serve it for centuries, but he also demonstrated how easily good intentions can become terrible realities when power goes unchecked. The first emperor's story forces us to grapple with some of the most difficult questions in human history. How much suffering is acceptable in pursuit of a greater good? When does strong leadership cross the line into oppression? Is it possible to build something great and lasting without leaving a trail of broken lives behind you? What lessons can we draw from this ancient empire? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world. These aren't just ancient questions. They're dilemmas that every generation faces as we try to balance the need for effective governance with respect for individual rights, the desire for unity with appreciation for diversity, the pursuit of grand achievements with concern for their human costs. Perhaps the first emperor's greatest legacy isn't the Great Wall or the Terracotta Army or even the unified Chinese state. Perhaps it's the enduring reminder that power, even when used with good intentions, must be tempered with wisdom, restraint, and genuine concern for the people it affects. His story shows us both the incredible potential of human ambition and the terrible dangers of letting that ambition run unchecked. In the end, the first emperor achieved a kind of immortality he never expected, not through mercury pills or magical elixirs, but through the ideas he unleashed and the questions he left us to answer. Every time we struggle with the balance between order and freedom, between unity and diversity, between great dreams and human dignity, we're still grappling with the legacy of that ambitious young king who dared to reshape the world and paid the ultimate price for his audacity. The Qin Dynasty lasted only 15 years, but the questions it raised about power, leadership, and the cost of greatness will challenge humanity for as long as we continue to dream of building better worlds.